Hey everyone, I'm here with Tim Alberta. Tim is a staff writer for The Atlantic and also the author of The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. Hey Tim, how are you doing?
Hey, Marcus. I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm doing really good, and I'm really glad that we get to have this important conversation today. Just tell us briefly what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a reporter, writer, work in the fake news media for a magazine that's based in DC called The Atlantic, where I
Okay.
cover politics and religion and culture and sports whenever they let me. And maybe when November comes and goes, I'll get a chance to return to the
Yeah,
sports writing stuff.
there you
So
go.
that's my day job, and then I've also written 2 books.
That's great. That's great. And I want to ask you a quick little get to know you question. What job would you be terrible at?
Well, a lot of jobs. I'm not the most qualified guy to do a lot of important things. I don't think I'd be terribly good operating on anyone or trying to launch a
Mm-hmm.
rocket into space. You know what I'd be really bad at, as I'm admiring the Rembrandt behind you, The
Oh,
Prodigal
yeah.
Son. I think I'd be a terrible painter because the
Mm-hmm.
uh, just the patience it
Yeah.
requires
Yeah.
to, I mean, never mind the skill, obviously, but
Yeah.
just the
Yeah.
patience. I don't have the patience. I'm a
Uh,
little too jumpy to be a painter, so I'll
uh,
go with that.
okay. Yeah, that's a great answer. You've got your own kind of art. Writing is an art, but it's a different, right? It's different. And
Yeah.
anyway, I love it. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation. The book again is "The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory: American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism," and uh, you had sort of an inciting incident, right? That sort of said, I think I want to explore this a little bit more. And it had to do with you at your dad's funeral. Would you tell us that story, what happened, and yeah, what that did to you and your wife, even?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, the EPC, and my dad was the senior pastor of our church. Had served there for nearly 30 years, and he had just retired pretty shortly before he passed away suddenly 5 summers ago.
Hmm.
And I had already been at that point sort of deep into my journalism career. I had actually, just before my dad died, I had published my first book, which was
Hmm.
called American Carnage, and it was all about basically Donald Trump's takeover of the Republican Party
Hmm.
and the ways in which the sort of old guard, the establishment of the GOP, had collapsed in the face of Trumpism. And I was pretty critical at times in that book of Donald Trump, and that didn't always go over well with friends, family members, people from back home, which is fine. I mean, I have a sense of humor about these
Yeah.
things, and I'm happy to mix it up and talk politics with anybody as long as it's sort of respectful and fun and in good faith. But what happened was, because that book had just come out and because I was taking a lot of heat from right wing media, when I went home for the funeral at the church where I'd grown up since I was a toddler, basically, there were a number of people who really gave me the business, so to
Hmm.
speak, and
Yeah.
wanted to give me a piece of their mind right then and there at the viewing when my dad
Yeah.
was in a casket nearby.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty upsetting episode. And in fact, the next
Hmm.
day when I was eulogizing my dad, I even made a point of saying, kind of raising that and saying, like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
And honestly, I think I had already, Marcus, been nurturing some wounds from the church,
Hmm.
like many people do.
Yep.
I love the church I grew up in. A lot of amazing people,
Yep.
but like any institution, it's got its flaws, it's got its blind spots, it's got its hypocrisies, and
Yep.
so I think I had really struggled throughout my young adult life, into my adult life, with some of what I saw in the evangelical world, and including at my own church, and I'd sort of turned a blind eye to it and tried to just be a good team player, and didn't want to feed into a lot of the negative stereotypes around evangelicalism. But
Hmm.
I think that was really, for me, as you said, sort of an
Yeah.
inciting incident, a kind of a
Yeah.
galvanizing moment where I felt sort of ashamed for having not been willing to look this in the eye and address it head on in a way that I would have had it been any other sort of reporting assignment. And so I think in a lot of ways that feeling of almost guilt really spurred me to take this project on.
Yeah. And how did it affect your family? This response that you got in that at your dad's funeral?
Yeah, I mean, not real. It didn't go well. Didn't go over well. There were, it's a pretty touchy thing to have the occasion of your dad's burial be turned into a sort of political football. In fact,
Right.
The day that we buried my dad, after I'd given that eulogy, I was given a note by someone at the church.
Yeah.
And when I first was handed it, I thought, oh, it's like a condolence card. And then I got home and I read it. And it was, in fact, this handwritten screed from one of the elders that I'd grown up with, somebody who'd known me since I was a little kid, basically telling me that, I was undermining God's ordained leader of the country and Donald Trump, and I should be ashamed of myself. And I was part of the deep state and all this, that, and the other thing. And, that was, I remember very vividly handing that note to my wife because she knew about all this stuff that had been going on the last couple of days. And she was pretty upset about it, but had been kind of counseling me to keep my cool and not let it affect me. Yeah. And I handed her that note. And she lost her mind. Because I think at that point, even she, who's a pretty calm, collected person, was just completely exasperated, trying to understand how anyone, much less a believer, how anyone of good conscience could be so callous and insensitive in a moment like that.
Yeah. And I think she said something like, "What in the world is wrong with us or with them?" Right? And maybe it was, "What the hell is wrong with them?"
I think the quote, I think the quote was, "What the hell is wrong with these people?"
Oh, that's it. So you say then shortly after that, I remember in the book you said, "And so what the hell is wrong with us? What happened to us? How did we get here?" And so maybe let's just sort of talk about that. How did we get from where maybe we were, wherever that was? How do we get here?
So I think, Marcus, my simplest answer to that very complicated question is there is something uniquely American about this. We have to start with our American identity. And what do I mean by that? Well, look, if you consider how so much of Scripture is written from the perspective of the underdog, the oppressed, the persecuted, the martyred, and you think about even the fundamental teachings of Christ, and the last shall be first, and blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers. You start to think about the ways in which our American disposition, our American privilege that we are blind to so often because it's just all we know. It's what we've been raised with. It's the waters that we've swum in since we were, born. And I think it's very difficult for us as a coddled and comfortable and wealthy people to really establish any sort of connection with or relation to that struggle that you see articulated all throughout, particularly the Gospels, but all throughout Scripture. And to place ourselves at really and truly as exiles in this metaphorical Babylon. And I think that the problem with the American Christian experience really comes down to this sense that, well, but we're different, right? We are a nation set apart. We are a blessed country. We are, even in the perspective of many Christians I've talked to, we are a new Israel. We are in covenant with God, right?
Right. Right.
That this nation was conceived in relationship with the Almighty. And
Yeah.
I think when you combine those factors, when you start to go down this road of believing uh, that by fighting to defend America,
Yeah.
that you are also sort of fighting to defend God Himself,
Right.
and that they're
Right.
one and the same.
Yeah.
And when you think about how your status in this country is in danger
Hmm.
from people who are not Christians, whether they belong to another religion or whether they are secular, atheist, humanist, woke, pagan, whatever, progressive, whatever the label is.
Yeah.
You start to feel as though that that the princes and principalities are in fact your political opponents, are in fact your cultural opponents, that the spiritual warfare that we all must be cognizant of, and that we are engaged in as Christians,
Hmm.
that it is actually synonymous with political warfare. And
Yeah.
I think that's the sort of slippery slope that over several generations much of the evangelical world has kind of succumbed to. And
Yeah.
that's again sort of the simplest, very, very reductive answer I can give you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. There's a lot to it, certainly. There's sort of an entitlement that it feels like a lot of Christians have, a sense of, well, we are owed because we are the people of God. And in a lot of ways, maybe even similar to what the ancient people of Israel felt at times, where, well, we're the chosen people. And so we deserve to have whatever power and wealth and influence and whatever it might be. Um, there is something, and you kind of talked about it. There's something that maybe we're afraid of. What are we afraid of losing? And when I say we, I mean kind of the evangelical church that you're describing. What are we afraid of losing that maybe we have had, or maybe we never had? I don't know.
I think a lot is made of this idea that Christians in America once lived in a positive world where
Hmm.
to be a Christian was ultimately beneficial. And we saw that in the ways that a basic Judeo Christian ethic was present and manifest in
Mm-hmm.
American life, in our
Yeah.
institutions, in our education system. Just that the culture was fundamentally friendly to and sympathetic to Christian ideals, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that now the script has flipped, and we live in a negative world where
Mm.
the culture and the institutions of American life and our sort of basic social norms and etiquette are actually hostile toward Christian
Yeah.
ideals.
Yeah.
And I think what we start to tell ourselves in that situation is not only that we are under attack and that
Mm-hmm.
we are in danger of losing our children because they're going to be indoctrinated. We're losing our status because the church is being targeted by the government, and they're going after us and shutting us down. But you also, in that sort of under siege mentality that I write about a
Yeah.
lot in the book, you begin to convince yourself that desperate times call for desperate measures,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that the ends justify the means. The ends
Yeah.
being a
Right.
reclamation of Christian America
Right.
and a return to a time in which the country was more closely identified with Judeo-Christian values. That end is so important
Yeah.
that the means to it becomes really irrelevant and
Yeah.
insignificant. And so,
Yeah.
therefore, we are willing, in the pursuit of restoring Christian virtue, we are willing to do away with Christian virtue. We are
Yeah.
willing to
Yeah.
lie, cheat, and steal,
Yeah.
and ally ourselves with all sorts of people and organizations and institutions
Yeah.
that bear no resemblance to the Christian ethic itself.
Yeah.
But we tell ourselves that it has to be done in
Right.
order to get to a better place.
Right.
And I think once you've started down that path, Marcus,
Yeah.
it's really dangerous.
Yeah.
It's really,
Yeah.
really dangerous
Yeah.
because the world is watching,
Yes.
and they expect us to hold ourselves
Yeah.
to a higher standard, but in many
Yeah.
cases, we've abandoned that standard
Right.
altogether.
Right. Yeah. One of the lines that you wrote that I had to underline was you said the first step toward preserving Christian values, it seemed, was to do away with Christian values. And that is exactly what we are seeing. And the question that I keep asking is, how can that be? Like when Donald Trump became the candidate and all these really good people around me, and I'm like, are you not seeing what I'm seeing? Like, how can any of us who are followers of Jesus give into that kind of allow for that kind of character or that lack of integrity? I'm saying maybe more than I'm used to saying in this podcast, but that's okay. This is the conversation we're having right now. But you've kind of already answered. I'm just expressing the frustration that I have felt, right? How did we get here, right? How is it that we could let go of that which is so central to who we are as followers of Jesus, right? People who live by the fruit of the Spirit. I always, when I'm talking to friends and family, I say, where are you seeing the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, right? And if you don't see any of those, like, is it actually Christianity that we're preserving here, right? And maybe that's something to talk about. Like, I would hesitate to call it even real Christianity anymore if we're not pursuing those, like the fruit of the Spirit, a life that looks like Jesus. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, maybe it's a broken Christianity. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, a couple of things. I think when we consider the intersection of religion and politics, and particularly Christianity and American Republican politics, look, I know lots of people who voted for Donald Trump for lots of different reasons. And I'm very careful in the book to try to make clear that I do not cast any sweeping aspersion on these millions of folks who did so. I think that there is fundamentally a difference between making a prudential political decision, and oftentimes a pained one,
that's
because
true.
you feel like there's a binary choice in front of you, and boy, there are some things I really care about, but I really can't stand this individual, and you do it, and you kind of feel guilty, but whatever.
That's true.
There's a difference between that and actively cheerleading for someone who, as you said, is lives their life in a way that is antithetical to the fruit of the Spirit, that is antithetical to the regenerative example of what it means to be, what it means to have had an encounter with the risen Christ and to live your life in the pursuit of sanctification, to become more and more like Him. I think what we have to try to do is understand both the ways in which political power becomes blinding to many Americans, and be sympathetic to that, because the stakes are high. The country has changed. We are living in very uncertain and strange times, and we can understand that and acknowledge that and think through that and talk about that in a way that is charitable and honest. But also acknowledge the damage done to the beauty of the gospel when we turn Christianity into a partisan political sport, when Jesus becomes a mascot for the Republican Party. And that is so much of what I'm documenting in the book, is, the extraordinary and really egregious ways in which people who know better have willingly, actively taken the gospel of Jesus Christ and distorted it
Yeah.
in a way so as to kind of create a barrier to entry for anyone on the outside who does not share their political views.
Yeah.
And, as far as I can tell, Marcus, there are some litmus tests for being a follower of Christ, but
Mm-hmm.
party registration is not one of them, the last I checked.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when I talk about the damage done,
Yeah.
it's not just internally. I'll keep returning to this point, but again, the world is watching,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and not only is the world watching, but the world is hurting.
Yeah.
There are so many people
Right.
out there in these scary secular places that so many of us, sort of recoil from, who are badly in need of
Yeah.
the gospel, who we might be reaching otherwise and calling our brothers and sisters, if not for the fact that we are so quick to call them our enemies, because they don't vote the way we do, or don't think the way we do, or don't share our values on certain issues. And I think that it's a tragedy for the church, because we are ultimately called to carry out that Great Commission, and we're not doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the biggest tragedy is the world is getting a distorted understanding of who Jesus is, and then who would want to be a part of that, be in relationship with that Jesus. Personally, I have a hard time referring to myself, like, historically, in terms of what evangelicalism is. I would fall into the category of evangelical, right? But it doesn't mean what it used to mean. And so for the sake of the gospel, I'd rather just call myself a Presbyterian, because it doesn't carry any baggage the way, at least not the kind of baggage evangelical does anymore. And so that's a loss to us, and especially to us who are leaders, pastors. Some pastors, of course, are bought in to sort of the political extremism, maybe we might call it, but others are not. And you talk about the pastor at your dad's church, John Torres, who is the pastor who connected us, which I'm really grateful for, and the way that they've had to navigate these issues in their churches. Can you say a little bit about the challenges and maybe some of the success that they've had in navigating this challenge?
Sure. It's just an incredibly fraught time to be in ministry, as you know, Marcus. Matter of fact, your first question that you asked about what I wouldn't be good at, I don't think I'd be very good as a pastor in this moment. Again, for the same reason, I just don't have the patience for it. But look, it's amazing to me. As I traveled the country, I spent time in over 100 churches, different denominations, trying to understand the struggle inside of both the sort of small rural church and the big city church and everything in between. And really, what I kept coming back to was this immense pressure on pastors to be more than a pastor. In other words, their congregants, in so many cases, are looking to them in this moment, saying, okay, so what about masking? What about the vaccine? What about the trans issue? What about abortion? What about about everything, right? And some pastors are more willing than others to engage with that and to use the pulpit. Some of them do it responsibly, others don't do it responsibly. And I think what happens, though, is it's almost a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because those who do engage with it, their congregants want more and more and more. And they start to view their pastor as sort of a part-time pastor, but also a kind of part-time pundit, a part-time cultural commentator, part-time, prognosticator of world events, right? And that this sort of poses its own danger. And then on the other side of it, if the pastor doesn't engage with any of this and just says to his people, listen, we're not doing that here, that's not what this church is for, well, then their congregants naturally, nature abhors a vacuum, and those congregants are going to go find that information elsewhere, and they're
Yeah.
going to seek out, in many cases, some really unhelpful, irresponsible, dishonest
Yeah.
sources like Fox News or like a bunch of
Yeah.
these fringe right-wing podcasts or social
Yeah.
media pages that people are tuned into. And the next thing you know, the pastor has sort of lost his influence entirely over a lot of
Yeah.
these people
Yeah.
because he gets 45 minutes with them on a Sunday morning,
Yeah.
but the rest of the week, they are deluged with all of this other stuff, all
Right.
of this outside
Right.
noise, and it completely blocks out the gospel itself. And so
Yeah.
it's a lose-lose. I have
Mm-hmm.
not found many pastors who have really found any sort of a great balance, a great way to thread the
Yeah.
needle here.
Yeah.
It's a really difficult time.
Yeah, it sure is. I'll say I'm grateful for the church that I'm in right now, where we aren't feeling that. And I think it has to. I've been at this church for 2.5 years, and the previous pastor did a good job helping them navigate COVID, and then I came kind of at the end of that. And so, yeah, so I'm just grateful that we're not in that place. And I'm hopeful that because of that, we can be the kind of witness in our community that the world needs. That those who are, who don't know they need Jesus, right, can see, oh, in this local community, oh, here's the kind of community that I want to be a part of, the kind of relationships I want to have, these are the kinds of people that I want to become, right? And I think that's part of what has been lost is, well, it just goes back to the witness, right? We have lost the ability to say, this is who we're called to be. And so it's a matter, I'm thinking a matter of spiritual formation. And that's the challenge, is how do we do this? How do we navigate all this? One of the things that we focus on here at the Church Leadership Institute is adaptive leadership and navigating change, leading through change. Right, we talk about navigating loss. And so, well, let's reflect on that for a moment. We did talk about the kind of loss that Christians in general maybe feel culturally, that there's some kind of a past that we have lost. But in an individual church, and I don't know if you have an answer for this or thoughts on this, but when a pastor doesn't take on that role of pundit or here's how we need to fight back, but says, okay, let's learn together. Is there something that, from your experience, that congregation members feel like they're losing if they don't have that solid, here's what we're going to do? What do you think about that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. I think some of what we've seen in the last few years is this mass sorting in the evangelical world with a lot of people who had been members of congregations for 10, 20, 30 years, who are suddenly, like, overnight, uprooting and going to a church down the road because that pastor is willing to engage on the sort of hard-edged partisan politics in a way that their old pastor wasn't. That's, and I've seen some of that up close. And, the question I have whenever I see it, I know this is veering slightly off of the question you asked, but I think it's relevant.
Yeah.
There is something gained, certainly, in those instances for those people, right? They feel like, okay, the Christian America as we know it is slipping away from us.
Yeah.
And just as the pastors in the Great Awakenings on the frontier played an essential role in this sort of civilizational formation of this country, they need to be back on the front lines now to help us reclaim this version of the country that's slipping away from us, right? So there is something gained from their perspective. And I've had these conversations with a lot of those sorts of congregants. I think what's interesting, though, is the question of what is lost.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, you are actively now accessing some part of the church that you felt like you were missing earlier, right? Um, but it just sort of begs the question, at what cost? Because the body of believers, as we see throughout, we're told repeatedly, most poignantly in Revelation, right? Every nation, every tongue before the throne. Like, the body of believers, it was never intended to be monolithic. And so often when you have people sort of relocating and self-selecting into these very narrow ideological, cultural, ethnic spaces where they feel like they are now belonging to something that more closely aligns with their beliefs, that is, I think, necessarily cutting off opportunities for relationship and for growth with fellow brothers and sisters, with fellow believers in congregations where some of the hardest and most complicated issues of our time can be discussed, can be engaged, can be navigated together as a body of believers. Like, that's the good stuff. It's the hard stuff, but it's the good stuff that can happen in a healthy church. And I fear that in this kind of broader trend of self-selection that we see, not just in the church, but in American life at large. I've written a lot about this in my day job, but in terms of our schools that we send our kids to, what kind of cars we drive, where we buy our groceries. There's this classic setup from a political expert named Dave Wasserman, who's an electoral handicapper type. And he's built out this very sophisticated model for a couple of decades about how if you eat at Cracker Barrel or if you shop at Whole Foods, you are statistically like infinitely more likely to be voting for one party or the other, based on the county that you live in and based on your consumer habits. So this is my point, is that this goes way beyond the church. But you would hope, Marcus, or at least I hope, that the church might be the one institution in American life that could rise above that self-selection and that tribalism. And unfortunately, I think the church has, in some ways, become the most tribal, has become the most vulnerable to that sort of self-selection. And I think it's really damaged our ability to build those relationships inside and then to go out and be missional on the outside.
Yes. Yeah. And I think I'll offer a resource. We're kind of nearing our end here, a resource and one more thought, and we can reflect for a moment on that. But I spoke a few weeks ago, or a couple months ago, by the time this comes out, with Alan Hilton and Andrew Hanauer, both of whom have organizations that help bridge the divide in terms of the political polarization. And one of the things that they do is they bring different kinds of churches together in conversation. And that's one of the ways that we can, I think, lead that kind of learning in our congregations with our people, is just have conversations, right? To humanize one another, those that we disagree with. And that's one of the things that has been lost, is the humanizing that Jesus did. Jesus humanized everybody. No one was demonized, right? And the only people he criticized were the religious leaders. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. Not really a whole other thing, but it's one of the things. The other thing that saddens me is that, when Jesus came, he gave us this whole new understanding of who God is and who we are. And of course, it was an outgrowth, in a sense, of what we have in the Old Testament. And he's like, let me show you even more, right? And here's a God who embraces everybody, right? Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And the first, among the first people who came to visit this Messiah were the shepherds, who were outcasts, right? And or at least bottom of the social ladder, and the Magi, who were outsiders. They were from the other side of the border, and they were the ones invited to meet this new Messiah. And so there's sort of this expansiveness to what Jesus brought. So here's what came to mind as I was reading the book. Mark Labberton, who is the former president at Fuller, he said, I heard him tell this story when he was a young man. He did not grow up in a Christian house. His dad would say, the reason I'm not a Christian is because what religion always does is it takes something big and it makes it small. And then he went on to tell the story about how he became a Christian, said he was going to become a pastor. His dad said, well, let me invite the local Presbyterian pastor to come in. And that pastor spent the entire time telling him why he should become a Presbyterian. And it's because we have the best pension. And so his dad goes, see what I mean? And that's part of what I see happening is when we narrow Christianity down to just which political party is in charge, we've taken something big and amazing and beautiful and we've made it something small. And I'll just let you take that with for a final thought. What do you think?
My dad was pretty good with his one-liners from the pulpit. He became sort of known for his witty sayings, and one thing that he always used to tell his congregation, particularly around election time, was he would say, "God does not bite his fingernails."
I love that.
I think it's just worth. It might sound cute to some people, but really, like, how often do we dwell on that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If we think that the God who made the heavens and the earth, the Alpha and the Omega, the creator of the cosmos with his grand design for the ages, if we think that he is watching the exit polls in November,
right,
sort of, clamming up, worried that
oh no,
that we might have 4 more years of Donald Trump, or that we might have 4 more years of a Democratic administration. Like, your theology has become very small. And I would just encourage people, regardless of who they're going to vote for or whether they're going to vote at all, but in this death march toward November that we're all on together, this is going to be a really unpleasant couple of months in front of us. And I think we would all do well to, just dwell on perhaps Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. He is God. We are not. And ultimately, if we believe in his sovereignty and his goodness, then we can, in a healthy, proportional way, engage civically, engage politically, do your duties as a sort of lowercase c citizen of this country, while remembering all the time, as Paul wrote, that our citizenship, our capital C citizenship, I would say, is in heaven.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Oh, that's so good. Thank you for that encouragement here at the end. We need that 100%. Last thing, if anybody wants to connect with you or find out more about the work that you're doing, where might they go?
Yeah, so they can go to my website, which is www.buytimalberta.com. B-Y, not B-U-Y.
Right.
I'm not trying to sell you anything. And then my work is in the Atlantic, and I'm also on Twitter, and so you can come harass me there. If I said anything heretical, you can come and troll me on social media.
I bet you get plenty of that. We won't encourage more of that. Tim, thank you so much. Great conversation. Thank you for this book, which is so eye-opening, and I really learned a lot. Affirmed some things, but also opened my eyes to some new things. And so just really grateful for that. Thanks for this conversation.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.